Hello everyone and happy Friday. We will be covering Module 63 today, which is studying genetic and environmental influences on intelligence. And so here we have arrived again at the nature versus nurture debate. One of the best ways to look at the impacts of nature and nurture is to look first at twin studies because twins share a very similar genetic makeup. And then to look at adoptive siblings who do not share the same genetic makeup, but they do share the same environment. And from looking at those two types of studies, we can kind of narrow down what might be caused by nature and what might be caused by nurture. So starting first with identical twin studies, one of the most interesting things is that identical twins have nearly the same scores on intelligence tests. And I'll show you a chart in a second, but there is a high correlation of same test scores for identical twins. And so heritability, this simply means, or this is the extent to which intelligence differences are due to genetics. And that is what we're trying to figure out in this model is, are intelligence differences due to genetics or are they due to environment? And as you'll see in this module, it very much has to do with genetics. Another thing that twin brains have is very similar gray and white brain matter. Gray matter is like the cell bodies, the neurons themselves, and then the white matter is on like the inside of the brain, and that has more to do with the neural connections and the speed of synaptic connections inside of the brain. All right, so researchers found genetic combinations that account for about 2% of differences. And so even though there are studies that show that intelligence has a lot to do with genetics, in looking at different genes, it has been really difficult for them to try to figure out what gene variations account for individual intelligence differences. And in the same way that people or researchers try to look at gene combinations that make people tall or short or fat or skinny or funny or not funny, good personality, bad personality, it is very difficult for them to come up with specific gene variations that try to account for this. And so overall, they really haven't been successful with finding out which specific gene combinations make some people intelligent and others not as intelligent. Okay, so the cool thing about adoptive children studies is that it allows us to narrow down the environmental impacts on intelligence because adoptive siblings, again, don't have the same genetic makeup, but they do have the same environment. So a couple of things to note. Number one is that adoption increases intelligence scores. There was a Swedish study where there were children who were adopted out of poverty and into wealthier families and into a home where there are well-educated parents. And on average, their IQ scores were 4.4 points higher than their biological siblings who were not adopted. And so environment does have at least some impact on intelligence scores. There's also a modest correlation of a shared environment by virtual twins. So virtual twins would be like if I adopted a 4-year-old from China and a 4-year-old from India. So they are both the same age and they have a very similar environment, but they do not have anything genetic in common. And so what these studies have found is that there is a slight correlation between test studies done on virtual twins. Okay, mental similarities between adoptive children and parents decrease with age. And this is kind of interesting. So as time goes on, the similarities between adoptive children and adoptive parents begin to decrease. And what happens is as they get older, adopted children's scores begin to align with their biological parents. And so there's this shift whereby throughout their lifespan, these adopted children will begin to show the same levels of intelligence as their birth parents. Okay, and so this is showing heritability. This is looking at the similarity of intelligence scores. So first, looking at identical twins who are reared together, you can see that this is like a 0.85 positive correlation. That means their test scores are very similar. And then we have identical twins who are raised apart. And interestingly, identical twins who have different environments still have a high positive correlation, 0.7 positive. That's really good. But it is not as high as identical twins raised together. And then fraternal twins reared together share a positive 0.6 correlation. Siblings reared together, so brother and sister who were born 2 or 3 years apart, have about a 0.45 positive correlation. And then this would be like adopted siblings or virtual twins, unrelated individuals reared together, have a slight positive correlation in test scores. So you can see how twin and adoptive studies reveal a lot about the impact of genetics on intelligence. All right, so looking at the impact of the early environment on a child's intelligence. So there was a guy named J. McVicker Hunt who studied the children in an Iranian orphanage, and these children were neglected. So neglected that they couldn't sit up without being assisted at age 2, and at age 4, many of them still weren't walking. And so these children were severely neglected. And so he wanted to see if he could train the Iranian caregivers, teaching them how to play with the children, how to play language games, how to interact with them. And he wanted to see if that would impact their intelligence. And it did. The results were dramatic. So by 22 months, these infants could name more than 50 objects. They could name body parts. And in many cases, the visitors who came to the orphanage were so impressed that many of these babies were adopted. And this proves that a poor environment can depress cognitive abilities. Because think about it, before they started playing these games with the children and teaching them language and imitating their babbling noises and engaging them, many of them couldn't even sit up or walk. Another thing that can impact intelligence early on is the stresses of poverty. If a child goes to school and they haven't eaten breakfast, they don't know where they're going to stay that night, they don't know if they'll come home to a drunk parent or who they'll come home to, then it makes it really difficult for them to be able to sit in a classroom and concentrate on whatever is going on in that classroom because they are distracted by their impoverished situation at home. And so that distraction can cause them to score lower on intelligence tests. So the same guy who did the study on the Iranian orphanages also wrote a book in 1961 called Intelligence and Experience. And this book helped give rise to Project Head Start. And Head Start is a government-funded preschool that prepares preschool-age children for kindergarten. Many of the people that they serve are impoverished. And generally, studies have shown that Head Start is successful and that it prepares children for kindergarten. It gives a slight boost to their later health and also makes it slightly more likely that they will complete high school. Another important factor is a growth mindset. There's a psychologist named Carol Dweck who believes that intelligence is actually something that can be moldable. It's something that is changeable. It's not fixed. And so if a student has a growth mindset or a focus on learning and growing, and she says that the brain is like a muscle, and if you exercise it, it will grow. And so if you have this growth mindset, according to Carol Dweck, then you can actually increase your intelligence. And studies have found that, in fact, it is ability, it is opportunity, but it's also motivation that causes people to be successful. And there was one famous study of 168,000 Chilean 10th graders who came from low-income families, but they had this type of mindset. They had a growth mindset, and their test scores were comparable to high-income students who had a fixed mindset. And so these findings have been repeated over and over in many different studies. So it is important also to have a growth mindset. So intelligence is not something that is only genetic. In other words, you don't have any control over it. Your environment is also important, but so is your mindset. All right, that is all for today. I hope you guys have an awesome day and an awesome weekend. And don't forget to send me a picture of your notes.